The wind across West Texas in the autumn of 1890 carried with it the dust of a dying frontier. The great cattle drives had slowed to a trickle. The railroad had carved its iron path through land that once belonged only to the Comanche and the rattlesnake. Towns that had sprung up like wild mesquite now withered just as quickly, their wooden bones bleaching under a sun that showed no mercy. It was a time of transition, when the old ways were being buried beneath the weight of progress, and yet the earth itself seemed reluctant to let go of what had been spilled upon it. Blood, they say, has memory, and in Texas, where the soil was red long before the white man came, that memory ran deep and dark as any mine shaft. The town of Redemption Springs sat 30 miles southwest of Fort Stockton, in a basin where 3 dry creeks met during the rare seasons of rain. It had been established in 1879 by a consortium of ranchers and prospectors who believed the area rich in both grazing land and silver. They were half right. The grazing was adequate, though the summers were brutal and the water scarce. The silver never materialized. What did materialize in the summer of 1881 was a fever that killed 19 people in 6 weeks, most of them children. The town doctor, a man named Ephraim Caldwell, worked himself to exhaustion trying to save them, but the fever was relentless, and when it finally burned itself out, Caldwell was among the dead. They buried him in the small cemetery on the hill east of town, beneath a crude wooden cross that bore his name and the words, "He tried." 9 years later, in October of 1890, a man named Thomas Mercer arrived in Redemption Springs on the evening stage from Fort Stockton. He was 42 years old, lean as a fence post with gray eyes that had the look of someone who had seen too much and remembered all of it. He wore a black coat despite the heat and carried a single leather valise that contained everything he owned: 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a Bible, a revolver, and a daguerreotype of a woman who had been his wife before consumption took her in the winter of 1888. Mercer had been a surveyor for the Southern Pacific Railroad, but after his wife's death he had drifted west, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough to put down roots. He had no particular reason for coming to Redemption Springs except that the stage stopped there and he had nowhere else to go. The town was smaller than he expected, a collection of sun-beaten structures that seemed to crouch against the earth, as if trying to make themselves invisible to the merciless sky above. Main Street consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings, a general store with a false front that proclaimed ambitions the structure behind it could never fulfill, a saloon whose painted sign had faded to illegibility, a livery stable that smelled of hay and manure, and saddle leather even from a distance, a boarding house with a sagging porch and windows that reflected the dying light like dead eyes, a barber shop with a striped pole that had lost most of its paint, and a few structures whose purposes were less clear. Anonymous boxes of wood that might have housed anything from a blacksmith's forge to a coffin maker's workshop. Most of the buildings were constructed of rough-hewn timber, grayed and warped by the sun until they looked less like human constructions and more like natural features of the landscape, bones of some great beast that had died here long ago. Paint, where it existed, had long since peeled away, leaving bare wood that splintered at the touch. The few people Mercer saw on the street moved slowly, as if conserving energy for some greater effort yet to come, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their bodies reduced to silhouettes in the amber light of early evening. They watched him with the mild curiosity of those who have little to do but watch, their eyes following his progress down the dusty street with an attention that felt both casual and intense. And then they looked away, dismissing him as just another drifter blown in on the wind, soon to blow out again. Mercer took a room at the boarding house, a 2-story structure run by a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard. She was a large woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. When Mercer signed the register, she studied his handwriting with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You'll be in room 4, she said, handing him a tarnished key. "Supper's at 6. No drinking in the rooms, no visitors after dark, and the privy's out back. You pay by the week, in advance." Mercer paid her from a small roll of bills he kept in his coat pocket. As he turned to climb the stairs, Mrs. Pritchard spoke again. "You looking for work, Mr. Mercer?" He paused, one hand on the banister. "I might be," he said. "Depends on what's available." She nodded slowly. "You might talk to Samuel Hurst. He owns the general store. He's been looking for someone to help with inventory and such. His boy went off to San Antonio last month and never came back. Mercer thanked her and continued up the stairs. Room 4 was small and spare, a monk's cell more than a bedroom. A narrow bed with an iron frame and a thin mattress that sagged in the middle, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a mirror so tarnished it barely reflected an image, a single chair with a woven seat that had begun to unravel, and a window that looked out onto the street, its glass wavy with age and clouded with years of accumulated dust. The walls were bare except for a faded print of the Lord's Prayer in a cheap frame, the words barely legible beneath a patina of grime and fly specks. The room smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something faintly medicinal that reminded Mercer of sick rooms and death. He set his valise on the bed and stood at the window, watching the light fade from the sky in gradations of orange and purple, and finally deep indigo. The town seemed to grow quieter as darkness fell, the silence so profound it had weight and texture, pressing against the ears like water pressure at depth. And by the time the church bell rang 6 times in slow, measured tones that echoed across the empty spaces, the street was empty, swept clean of human presence as if some curfew had been declared. He could hear the wind moving through the spaces between the buildings, a low moan that rose and fell like breathing, like the respiration of some vast sleeping creature, and beneath that the distant yipping of coyotes out on the plain, their voices carrying for miles in the thin, dry air. Supper was served in a small dining room off the boarding house kitchen. There were 3 other guests: a traveling salesman named Porter who dealt in patent medicines, an elderly man named Jessup who said little and ate less, and a younger man with a scarred face who introduced himself only as Ray. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the occasional cough. The food was plain but adequate: beans, cornbread, a thin stew that might have contained beef. Mrs. Pritchard stood in the doorway to the kitchen, watching them eat with the same intensity she had brought to Mercer's handwriting. After supper, Mercer walked down to the saloon, a low building with a hand-painted sign that read, "The Dusty Rose." Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. A dozen men sat at tables or stood at the bar, their voices a low rumble beneath the sound of a piano being played badly in the corner. Mercer ordered a whiskey and stood at the bar listening. The talk was of cattle prices and the drought, of a ranch hand who had been thrown from his horse and broken his arm, of the new preacher who had arrived 2 weeks ago and already managed to offend half the town with his fire and brimstone sermons. No one paid Mercer much attention, and he was content to remain anonymous. It was nearly 9 when he heard the first mention of the house. 2 men at a nearby table were speaking in low voices, and one of them, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, said something about the Caldwell place. The other man, younger and cleaner shaven, shook his head. "I wouldn't go near it for all the silver in Mexico," he said. The first man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ain't nobody been inside since the doctor died. Hell, ain't nobody even tried, far as I know." The younger man leaned closer. "My cousin tried. Said he got as far as the door but couldn't get it open. Said it was locked from the inside, but there wasn't no keyhole, no bolt, nothing. Just wouldn't budge." Mercer felt a stirring of interest. He turned slightly, as if adjusting his position at the bar, and the movement caught the attention of the heavy-set man. "You new in town?" the man asked. Mercer nodded. "Came in on the evening stage." The man studied him for a moment, then gestured to an empty chair at their table. "Sit if you like. Name's Harlan Webb. This here's Billy Trost." Mercer introduced himself and sat down. Webb signaled the bartender for another round of drinks. "You were talking about a house," Mercer said. "The Caldwell place?" Webb exchanged a glance with Trost, then nodded. "Old Ephraim Caldwell's house. Been empty since he died back in '81. It's just outside town, maybe half a mile north. Big place. 2 stories, built from good timber. The doctor had money, or so they say. Brought it with him from back east, built that house like he was planning to stay forever." He paused to drink. "But the fever got him, same as it got the others. They found him in his bed, dead 3 days by the time somebody thought to check on him. They buried him up on the hill with the rest, and that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't," Trost said. His voice was quiet, almost reverential, because nobody could get into the house after that. The front door was shut tight, and no matter what anyone did, it wouldn't open. Some folks said it was locked from the inside, but like I said, there's no lock on that door. No keyhole, no bolt. Just a heavy oak door with an iron handle, and it won't move. Not for anyone." Mercer frowned. "Someone must have broken a window, gone in that way." Webb shook his head. Windows are all shuttered from the inside. And before you ask, no, nobody's tried breaking them. This is Texas, friend. A man's property is his property even if he's dead. Besides, there's something about that place that keeps folks away. You can feel it when you get close. Like the air's thicker there, harder to breathe, like something's watching you. Superstition, Mercer said, though he felt a chill despite the warmth of the saloon. Webb shrugged. Maybe, but I've lived here 9 years, and I've never known anyone to set foot inside that house since the doctor died, and I don't know anyone who wants to. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Mercer's mind lingered on the Caldwell house. After a time, he excused himself and walked back to the boarding house through the dark streets. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and creosote. Above, the stars were hard and bright, indifferent to the small concerns of the men and women below. In his room, Mercer lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about a door that wouldn't open and a man who had died trying to save children from a fever he couldn't understand. He thought about his own wife, dead these 2 years, and the way grief could lock itself inside a person unyielding as any door. Eventually he slept, though his dreams were troubled and he woke several times in the night listening to the wind. The next morning, Mercer walked to the general store and found Samuel Hurst behind the counter, tallying accounts in a ledger. Hurst was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the tired expression of someone who has worked hard all his life and has little to show for it. When Mercer explained that Mrs. Pritchard had suggested he might be looking for help, Hurst looked him over carefully. "You know figures?" he asked. Mercer nodded. "I can keep accounts. I've done surveying work, so I'm comfortable with numbers." Hurst considered this, then closed his ledger. "I can pay $3 a week, plus a 10% discount on goods from the store. Work's not hard, but it's steady. Inventory, stocking, dealing with customers when I'm busy. You interested?" Mercer was. They shook hands, and Hurst showed him around the store, explaining the layout and the system he used for tracking inventory. It was simple enough work, and Mercer was grateful for it. He had enough money to last a few weeks, but not much beyond that, and the thought of having a purpose, however small, was comforting. He started immediately, spending the rest of the morning reorganizing a shelf of dry goods, while Hurst dealt with a steady trickle of customers. During a lull in the early afternoon, Mercer asked Hurst about the Caldwell house. The storekeeper's expression darkened. "You've been talking to folks at the saloon," he said. It wasn't a question. Mercer admitted that he had. Hurst sighed and removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "Ephraim Caldwell was a good man," he said quietly. "One of the best I've known. He came here in '79, same year the town was founded. Said he wanted to build something lasting, a place where people could live and raise families. He was a good doctor, too. Saved my wife when she had trouble with our second child. When the fever came in '81, he worked day and night trying to stop it. Didn't sleep, hardly ate. Just went from house to house doing what he could. But the fever was too strong, and the children kept dying. 19 of them all told. And then Ephraim died too." Hurst replaced his spectacles and looked at Mercer with an expression that was difficult to read. "After he died, strange things started happening. The door to his house wouldn't open. Windows wouldn't break. People reported seeing lights in the upper windows at night, though nobody was inside. Some folks heard sounds like someone moving around in there. The preacher at the time, Reverend Marsh, he tried to perform some kind of blessing or exorcism, but he wouldn't go near the place after the first attempt. Said he felt something push him away, something he couldn't see. He left town a month later, said his health was failing. Died in Austin the following spring." "You believe any of that?" Mercer asked. Hurst was silent for a long moment. "I believe Ephraim Caldwell was a man who cared deeply about this town and the people in it. I believe he died trying to save children he couldn't save. And I believe that sometimes when a man dies with unfinished business, something of him remains. Whether that's his spirit or just the echo of his grief, I couldn't say. But I know that house isn't right. And I know I wouldn't go near it, not for all the money in Texas." That evening, after his work at the store was finished, Mercer walked north out of town toward the Caldwell house. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The road was little more than a dirt track, rutted from wagon wheels and baked hard by the sun. After about half a mile, he saw it, a 2-story structure standing alone on a slight rise, surrounded by scrub brush and prickly pear. It was, As Webb had said, a substantial building, well constructed from good timber that had weathered to a silvery gray. The windows on both floors were shuttered, and the front porch sagged slightly but appeared intact. A wooden fence, partially collapsed, surrounded what had once been a yard but was now overgrown with weeds. Mercer approached slowly, aware of a growing unease that seemed to intensify with each step. The air did feel different here, heavier somehow, as if the atmosphere itself were denser. The wind, which had been constant all day, seemed to die as he drew closer to the house, leaving an unsettling silence broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, noting the way the boards creaked beneath his weight, and stood before the front door. It was exactly as Webb had described. Heavy oak, dark with age, with an iron handle but no visible lock or keyhole. The wood was carved with simple geometric patterns, the work of a craftsman who took pride in his trade. Mercer reached out and grasped the handle. It was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been given the warmth of the day. He pulled, gently at first, then with increasing force. The door didn't budge. He pushed, then tried lifting while pulling, then putting his shoulder against it. Nothing. The door might as well have been part of the wall. He walked around the house, examining the shuttered windows. Each one was sealed tight, and when he tried to pry one open with his pocket knife, the wood refused to yield. It was as if the house had been locked, not with mechanisms, but with something far more fundamental, something that existed beyond the physical. As the sun sank below the horizon and darkness began to gather, Mercer became aware of being watched. There was no sound, no movement, but the sensation was unmistakable. He turned slowly, scanning the surrounding brush, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, a prickling at the back of his neck that made his skin crawl. He left the porch and walked quickly back toward town, resisting the urge to look back over his shoulder. By the time he reached the boarding house, night had fallen completely, and the stars were emerging in a sky as black as tar. The following days settled into a routine. Mercer worked at the general store, learning the rhythm of the town and its people. He took his meals at the boarding house, exchanged pleasantries with the other guests, and spent his evenings either reading or walking the quiet streets. But his mind kept returning to the Caldwell house and the mystery of the unopenable door. He asked questions carefully and without seeming too interested, and the answers he received only deepened the enigma. Everyone agreed that the house had been inaccessible since the doctor's death. Everyone agreed that strange things happened there. Lights in windows, sounds in the night, the sense of a presence that wanted to be left alone. But no one could explain why, and no one seemed particularly interested in finding out. On his 4th day in Redemption Springs, Mercer was approached by a man he hadn't seen before. It was late afternoon, and he was sweeping the floor of the general store when the man entered. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in black, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from weathered stone. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and when he looked at Mercer, it felt like being examined by something not quite human. "You're the new man," he said. His voice was dry, like wind through dead leaves. "Thomas Mercer." Mercer nodded, setting aside the broom. "That's right. And you are?" The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Jacob Weir. I'm the undertaker here in Redemption Springs. Also serve as the town's record keeper, such as it is. I understand you've been asking about Ephraim Caldwell." Mercer felt a twinge of caution. "Just curious," he said. "Heard some stories, wanted to know if they were true." Weir moved deeper into the store, his footsteps making no sound on the wooden floor. "They're true enough," he said. "I was the one who found Ephraim's body. Went to his house on a Tuesday morning because he hadn't been seen for 3 days, and folks were worried. The door was already sealed by then. I couldn't get in through the front, so I went around back, tried the kitchen door. Same thing. Locked tight, though there was no lock. I looked through a gap in one of the shutters and saw him lying in his bed, still as stone. Dead, obviously. Had been for days. His face was peaceful, or as peaceful as any face can be after 3 days in the Texas heat. How did you bury him if you couldn't get to the body?" Mercer asked. Weir's smile widened slightly. "I didn't. Nobody did. Ephraim Caldwell is still in that house, lying in his bed on the 2nd floor. We held a funeral service without a body, buried an empty coffin up on the hill. Seemed like the right thing to do. But the man himself, he's still in there." Mercer felt a chill run down his spine. "For 9 years?" Weir nodded. 9 years this October, and he'll be there 9 more or 90 unless something changes. That house won't give him up. It's like it's holding on to him, keeping him for some purpose we can't understand. Why are you telling me this? Mercer asked. Weir's pale eyes studied him for a long moment. Because you're different from the others who've come through here. You're not just curious. You're compelled. I can see it in you. You're going to try to get into that house, aren't you? Mercer didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Weir nodded slowly. When you do, be careful. Ephraim Caldwell was a good man, but death changes things. And something's been living in that house with his body for 9 years. Something that doesn't want to be disturbed. After Weir left, Mercer stood in the quiet store, his mind churning. The idea that Caldwell's body was still in the house, undiscovered and unburied, was deeply unsettling. But it also explained in a way the sense of presence that surrounded the place. If Weir was right, if the doctor was still there, then perhaps the house had become a kind of tomb, sealed by forces beyond understanding. But why? What purpose could it serve to keep a dead man locked away from the world? That night, Mercer dreamed. He was standing on the porch of the Caldwell house, and the door was open, swinging slowly inward on hinges that made no sound. Beyond the threshold was darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. As he watched, a figure emerged from that darkness. A man in a white shirt and dark trousers, his face obscured by shadow. The figure beckoned, a slow gesture of one hand, and Mercer felt himself drawn forward, his feet moving without his conscious will. He stepped through the doorway and into the darkness, and immediately the temperature dropped, the air turning cold enough that his breath came in visible puffs. The figure turned and walked deeper into the house, and Mercer followed, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. They climbed a staircase, the wood creaking beneath their weight, and emerged into a hallway lined with closed doors. The figure stopped before one of the doors and turned to face Mercer. In the dim light filtering through cracks in the shutters, Mercer could see the man's face for the first time. It was Ephraim Caldwell, or what remained of him, the flesh gray and sunken, the eyes hollow and dark. The corpse opened its mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged, only a dry rattling like wind through bones. Then Caldwell raised one skeletal hand and pointed to the door. Mercer reached for the handle, his hand trembling, and the moment his fingers touched the cold metal, he woke. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding, sweat soaking his shirt despite the coolness of the night. The dream had felt real, more real than any dream he had ever experienced. He could still feel the cold of the house, could still see Caldwell's ruined face pointing at that door. He rose and went to the window, looking out at the dark street below. The town was silent, wrapped in sleep, but Mercer knew he wouldn't sleep again that night. Something was calling to him, something in that house, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would have to answer that call. The next morning he asked Samuel Hurst for the afternoon off, claiming he needed to take care of some personal business. Hurst agreed without question, and Mercer spent the morning working with an intensity that surprised even himself. As if by focusing on the mundane tasks of inventory and stocking, he could quiet the unease that had been building since the dream. But when noon came and he left the store, he walked directly north, out of town, and toward the Caldwell house. It was a clear day, the sky a hard blue dome overhead, the sun bright and merciless. But as Mercer approached the house, clouds began to gather, rolling in from the west with unnatural speed. By the time he reached the front porch, the sky had darkened to the color of old bruises and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain, though no rain fell. He stood before the door again, that same heavy oak barrier, and placed his hand on the iron handle. It was cold as before, but this time there was something else, a faint vibration, as if something deep within the house were humming at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. He pulled, knowing it was futile, and the door remained shut. He pushed. He tried to lift and turn the handle. He put his full weight against the wood and nothing changed. The house remained sealed, impregnable. Frustration welled up in him, followed by anger, and he stepped back and kicked the door with all his strength. Pain shot through his foot, but the door didn't even shudder. He shouted, a wordless cry of rage and desperation, and the sound echoed across the empty land. And then, in the silence that followed, he heard it, a voice faint and distant coming from inside the house. It was speaking words he couldn't quite make out, but the tone was clear, pleading, desperate, filled with a sorrow so profound It made Mercer's chest ache. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. The voice continued, rising and falling, sometimes forming what sounded like words, sometimes dissolving into a low moan that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. It went on for several minutes, and then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of the wind. Mercer stepped back from the door, his mind reeling. He had heard something, he was certain of it. Something or someone inside that house was trying to communicate, trying to reach out across the barrier that separated the living from the dead. He thought of Caldwell's body, lying in a bed on the second floor, slowly decaying but never quite gone, preserved somehow by whatever force had sealed the house. And he thought of his dream, of the corpse pointing to a door with skeletal fingers. He walked around the house again, examining every shutter, every board, looking for any weakness, any point of entry. There was none. The house was as solid as a fortress, and just as impregnable. As the afternoon wore on, the clouds overhead grew darker, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Mercer knew he should return to town before the storm hit, but he was reluctant to leave. He felt as though he were on the verge of understanding something important, something that lay just beyond his grasp. It was then that he noticed the root cellar. It was on the north side of the house, a slanted wooden door set into the ground, secured with a rusted iron latch. He knelt beside it and examined the latch. It was old, corroded by years of weather, but it wasn't locked. He lifted the latch and pulled, and to his surprise, the door opened, creaking on hinges that hadn't moved in years. A rush of cool, musty air emerged from the darkness below, carrying with it the smell of earth and rot. Mercer hesitated. Going into that cellar felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. But he had come this far, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain, and turning back now seemed impossible. He descended the rough wooden steps, one hand on the damp stone wall for balance, into the darkness below. The cellar was small, perhaps 10 feet square, with a dirt floor and stone walls that wept with moisture. Light filtered down through the open door above, providing just enough illumination to see by. The space was largely empty, save for a few broken crates and what looked like the remains of stored vegetables, long since rotted to black mush. But at the far end of the cellar, Mercer saw another door, this one set into the wall and leading, he assumed, into the house proper. He approached the door and placed his hand on it. Unlike the front door, this one was rough pine, unfinished and utilitarian. There was no handle, just a simple latch. He lifted the latch and pushed. The door swung open easily, almost eagerly, and Mercer found himself looking into a narrow hallway lit by a strange, dim glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He stepped through the doorway and into the house. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been, and it carried a smell he recognized from his time working as a surveyor in areas where men had died and been left unburied. The sweet, cloying stench of decay. But beneath that was something else, something that reminded him of the smell before a lightning strike, sharp and electric. The hallway extended perhaps 20 feet before opening into a larger room. Mercer moved forward slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The room he entered was a kitchen, or had been once. A cast-iron stove sat cold and dark against one wall. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the space, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. Cabinets lined the walls, their doors hanging open to reveal empty shelves. Everything was exactly as it had been left 9 years ago, frozen in time, waiting. Mercer moved through the kitchen to a door that led into what appeared to be a dining room. Here, too, everything was preserved. A long table set for a meal that was never eaten, chairs pushed back as if the diners had just risen and walked away. Dust lay over everything like a shroud. From the dining room, he found a staircase leading to the second floor. The banister was smooth and well-crafted, the work of someone who took pride in detail. As Mercer climbed, the temperature continued to drop, and he could see his breath in the air before him. The smell of decay grew stronger, mixing with that strange electric scent until it was almost overwhelming. At the top of the stairs was a hallway identical to the one in his dream, narrow, lined with closed doors, lit by that same sourceless glow. Mercer stood in the hallway, his heart pounding, and looked at the doors. There were 4 of them, 2 on each side. In his dream, Caldwell had pointed to one of them, but Mercer couldn't remember which. He approached the first door on the left and placed his hand on the knob. It was ice cold, so cold it burned. He turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a bedroom, sparsely furnished with a bed, a wardrobe, and a washstand. The bed was made, the coverlet smooth and undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air in the room was so cold that frost had formed on the window panes, despite the warmth of the day outside. Mercer backed out and closed the door. The second door opened onto a similar room, empty and frozen. The third door, when he opened it, revealed a small study. A desk, a chair, shelves lined with medical books and journals. Papers were scattered across the desk, covered in neat handwriting that documented cases, treatments, symptoms. Mercer picked up one of the pages and read, October 3rd, 1881. The Jennings boy died this morning. I could do nothing. The fever takes them so quickly now. Mary Caldwell, age 6, showing first symptoms. God help me, I don't know how to stop this. The date made Mercer's blood run cold. October 3rd, 1881 was 3 days before Caldwell himself died. He set the paper down and backed out of the study, pulling the door closed. That left one door, the last one at the end of the hall. He approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at him to flee, to get out of this cursed house and never return. But he couldn't. He had come too far. He reached for the knob, expecting it to be as cold as the others, but instead it was warm, almost hot. He jerked his hand back, then forced himself to grasp it again. The heat was intense but not unbearable. He turned the knob and pushed. The room was larger than the others, clearly the master bedroom. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its posts carved with intricate designs. And in the bed, covered to the chest with a quilt, lay the body of Ephraim Caldwell. Mercer stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. The body was perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decomposition. Caldwell looked as though he were merely sleeping, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest, but his eyes were open, and they were looking directly at Mercer. As Mercer watched, paralyzed by terror, Caldwell's mouth opened. The movement was slow, deliberate, and accompanied by a dry, creaking sound like old leather being stretched. The lips moved, forming words, and a voice emerged, thin and reedy but unmistakably human. You came, it said. After all this time, someone finally came. Mercer tried to speak, but no sound came out. He backed away from the doorway, but his legs felt like lead, barely responding to his commands. Caldwell's body began to sit up, moving with the same slow, deliberate motion, the quilt falling away to reveal a white nightshirt stained with what looked like old blood. Don't be afraid, the voice said, though there was nothing in the world more terrifying than a corpse speaking with a dead man's voice. I've been waiting for someone who could open the door, waiting for someone who could understand. You're dead, Mercer managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. Caldwell's head turned toward him, the movement accompanied by a sound like dry twigs snapping. Am I? The corpse asked. I died, yes. I remember dying. I remember the fever burning through me, the pain, the darkness, but I didn't leave. I couldn't leave. Not while they were still here. Who? Mercer asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. Caldwell raised one hand, pointing to the floor. The children, he said. The 19 children who died while I watched, helpless to save them. They're here. They've always been here. Trapped in this house, trapped by my failure, by my guilt. I couldn't let them go. I couldn't let myself go. So we remained. We all remained. As if in response to his words, Mercer heard sounds from below. Footsteps, small and quick, running through the rooms on the first floor. Voices, children's voices, calling out in play, or perhaps in distress. The sounds grew louder, coming up the stairs, filling the hallway outside the bedroom. Mercer turned to look and saw them. Small figures, translucent and flickering like candle flames, moving through the hallway with the aimless energy of children at play. Some were laughing, some were crying. All of them were dead. I tried to save them, Caldwell said, and there was infinite sorrow in his voice. I tried everything I knew, every treatment, every remedy, but the fever was too strong, and they died one by one. And I stood by their bedsides and held their hands and lied to them, told them they would be fine, told them they would see their mothers and fathers again. And then I got sick, and then I died. And then I realized that death hadn't freed me from my failure. It had only made it eternal. The ghost children filled the hallway, their forms growing more solid, more visible. Mercer could see their faces now, some peaceful, some twisted in pain or fear. They turned to look at him, their eyes dark and empty. and he felt the weight of their gaze like a physical thing. "What do you want?" he asked Caldwell, his voice shaking. "Why did you let me in?" Caldwell rose from the bed, standing on legs that should not have been able to support weight. He was taller than Mercer had expected, gaunt as a scarecrow, his nightshirt hanging loose on his skeletal frame. "I want what I've always wanted," he said. "I want to save them. I want to give them what I couldn't give them when I was alive. Peace, rest, an end to their suffering. But I can't do it alone. I've tried for 9 years, and I can't. I need help. I need someone from the world of the living to do what the dead cannot." "I don't understand," Mercer said, though he was beginning to, with a creeping horror that made his skin crawl. Caldwell moved toward him, and the ghost children parted to let him pass, their small hands reaching out to touch him as he moved. "The door," Caldwell said, "the front door of this house. It's been sealed since I died. Sealed by my will, by my refusal to let go. Only someone who has crossed the threshold between life and death can open it from the inside. Someone who has died but lives. Someone like you." "I'm not dead," Mercer said, but even as he spoke the words, doubt crept in. Caldwell smiled, a terrible expression on his preserved face. "Aren't you?" he asked. "You've been dead for 2 years, Thomas Mercer. Dead since the day your wife died. You just didn't know it. You've been walking through the world like a ghost, going through the motions, feeling nothing, connecting to no one. You're as dead as I am. You just haven't lain down yet." Mercer wanted to deny it, wanted to shout that Caldwell was wrong, but the words stuck in his throat, because somewhere deep inside he knew it was true. He had died with his wife, died in spirit if not in body, and everything since had been a kind of dream, a sleepwalk through a life that held no meaning. He had come to Redemption Springs because he had nowhere else to go, no purpose, no connection to the world. He had been drawn to this house because it was a tomb, and tombs were where the dead belonged. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and his voice was hollow, empty. Caldwell placed a cold hand on his shoulder, and Mercer felt the chill of it seep through his coat and shirt and into his bones. "Come," Caldwell said. "Come with me. We'll go to the door together. You'll open it, and the children will be free. They'll be able to leave this place to go wherever the dead are meant to go, and I'll be free too. Free from the guilt that's kept me here. Free from the weight of failure. We'll all be free." Mercer allowed himself to be led down the stairs, through the dining room and kitchen to the front entrance. The ghost children followed, a procession of small, flickering forms, their voices a whisper of wind through dead leaves. In the entrance hall, Mercer stood before the heavy oak door, the same door he had tried to open from the outside just days before. Caldwell stood beside him, one hand still on his shoulder. "Open it," the doctor said softly. "Open it and set us free." Mercer reached for the iron handle. It was still cold, but now the cold felt right, felt familiar, like coming home. He grasped it firmly and pulled. The door swung open easily, as if it had never been locked at all, revealing the porch and the yard beyond, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The wind rushed in, warm and alive, carrying with it the scent of dust and mesquite in the vast open spaces of Texas. The ghost children moved forward, streaming through the open door like water released from a dam. They ran into the light, their forms growing fainter and fainter until they vanished completely, dissolving into the air like mist in the sun. One by one they went, laughing or crying or silent, until only Caldwell remained. The doctor stood in the doorway, his preserved face turned toward the light, and for a moment, Mercer saw him as he must have been in life, strong, determined, full of purpose and compassion. "Thank you," Caldwell said, and then he too stepped through the doorway and was gone. Mercer stood alone in the empty house, the door still open before him. He could hear the wind outside, the sounds of birds, the distant lowing of cattle, the world of the living going on without him as it always had, as it always would. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were translucent, flickering like the hands of the ghost children had been. The realization came slowly but without surprise. Caldwell had been right. He was dead. Had been dead. The moment he opened that door, the last connection he had to life had been severed. He walked through the door and onto the porch, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face for the first time in what felt like years. The sky was clear now, the clouds gone, the blue so deep and pure it hurt to look at. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in the air, feeling the wind on his skin, and then he began to walk. Away from the house, away from the town, out into the empty land where the frontier stretched on forever. Behind him, the Caldwell house stood silent and still, its door open to the wind, no longer a prison but just a structure of wood and nails, slowly returning to the earth from which it had been built. In Redemption Springs, the townspeople would discover the open door the next morning. They would enter the house cautiously, fearfully, and find it empty, save for the dust and the silence. In the master bedroom, they would find the bed neatly made, the quilt folded at the foot, and no sign that anyone had lain there for 9 years. Ephraim Caldwell's body would be gone, vanished as completely as the children who had died on his watch. Some would say it was a miracle. Others would say it was the work of the devil. But all would agree that whatever curse had held that house sealed for 9 years had finally been lifted. Jacob Weir, the undertaker and record keeper, would enter Thomas Mercer's name in his ledger of deaths, noting that the man had disappeared on October 17, 1890, and was presumed dead, cause unknown. Samuel Hurst would keep Mercer's last week's pay in the store safe for a year, waiting for him to return, before finally donating it to the church. Mrs. Pritchard would rent room 4 to a new boarder, a drifter named Collins, who claimed to be a former Texas Ranger. No one would speak of Mercer again after that, except to note that he had been a quiet man who kept to himself and had seemed troubled by something he never named. The door to the Caldwell house would remain open for 3 days before the wind blew it shut again, but this time it wouldn't be locked. Anyone who wished could open it, could walk through the rooms where Ephraim Caldwell had lived and died and waited. Some did, out of curiosity or morbid fascination, and they would report finding nothing unusual, just an old house slowly falling into ruin, as all houses eventually do. The story of the unopenable door would fade into legend, told in saloons and around campfires, each telling adding new details or stripping away old ones, until the truth became indistinguishable from fiction. But those who had lived through it, who had seen the house sealed and then unsealed, would remember. They would remember Ephraim Caldwell and his failed fight against the fever. They would remember the children who died. And some, late at night when the wind was high and the stars were bright, would think of Thomas Mercer and wonder where he had gone, and whether he had found what he was looking for. The wind across West Texas carries many things: dust and seeds, the cries of hawks, the smell of rain that never comes. But it also carries the voices of the dead, those who died with work unfinished, with debts unpaid, with promises broken. It carries them across the empty spaces between the towns and the ranches, across the mesas and the dry creek beds, searching always for someone who will listen, someone who will understand. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear them still, calling out from the places where they fell, asking to be remembered, asking to be released, asking for one more chance to do what they could not do in life. In 1890, in a town called Redemption Springs, a door that no one could open was finally opened by a man who was already dead. It was opened with compassion, with understanding, with the knowledge that the dead are not so different from the living, that we all carry our failures and our griefs, and that sometimes the only way to find peace is to help another find theirs. The children who died in the fever of 1881 went free that day. Ephraim Caldwell went free, and Thomas Mercer, who had been dead in spirit long before his body gave out, found at last the purpose that had eluded him in life: to be a bridge between worlds, to be the hand that opens doors that should remain closed, to be remembered not for what he accomplished, but for what he allowed others to accomplish through him. The house still stands, they say, though it's little more than a shell now, picked over by scavengers and weather-beaten by decades of wind and rain. The door hangs crooked on its hinges, swinging open and closed as the wind dictates. Children from the newer settlements sometimes dare each other to go inside, to climb the creaking stairs, to stand in the master bedroom where a doctor once died trying to save lives he couldn't save. But they never stay long. There's something about that house that makes people uncomfortable, something that whispers of old sorrows and older debts, something that reminds them that the past is never truly past, that the dead are never truly gone, and that every door, no matter how firmly locked, can be opened by someone with the right key. And that key, as Thomas Mercer learned, is not made of metal or magic. It's made of something far simpler and far more profound: the recognition that we are all dying, all moving toward the same darkness, and that the only thing that matters in the end is whether we helped someone else find their way, whether we opened doors for others when we could, whether we gave freely of ourselves even when we had nothing left to give. In that cold house in the Texas scrubland, on a day in October when the wind was high and the sky was troubled, that lesson was learned and taught, and both the living and the dead were changed by it. Some frontiers, as the saying goes, were never meant to be crossed, but others exist precisely so that someone someday will gather the courage to cross them, will step into the unknown and emerge changed, or not emerge at all. The frontier between life and death is one such place, and it's policed not by angels or demons but by ordinary people whose extraordinary circumstances have given them a view of both sides, a foot in both worlds. Thomas Mercer became one such person, not through any choice of his own but through the simple fact of his grief, his loss, his willingness to continue walking even when the ground beneath his feet had become uncertain. The town of Redemption Springs still exists, though it's changed names twice since 1890, and is now little more than a wide spot in the road with a gas station and a boarded-up general store. The cemetery on the hill is still there, overrun with weeds and tumbleweeds, the wooden crosses long since rotted away or blown down, but the graves remain, shallow depressions in the red earth, marking the places where people who had names and lives and stories were laid to rest and forgotten. Among them is the grave marked for Ephraim Caldwell, still empty after all these years, a monument to a man who never truly rested there. And somewhere in that vast empty land, walking still perhaps, or at rest at last in some place beyond mortal knowing, is Thomas Mercer, the man who opened the door that no one else could open because he alone was both alive and dead, present and absent, a ghost who hadn't yet lain down. History doesn't record what became of him, whether he found peace or simply faded into the wind like the ghost children he helped to free. But those who tell the story like to think that he did find peace, that in helping Ephraim Caldwell and the children he helped himself, that in opening that door he opened his own heart to the possibility of rest. The story ends as all stories must, but the door remains literal and metaphorical, a reminder that we are all just temporary residents in this world, that we all have doors we cannot open, walls we cannot breach, sorrows we cannot shed. And sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're willing to listen, if we're open to the possibility that the answers we seek might come from the most unexpected places, we find someone who can help us, who can offer us the key we've been searching for, who can remind us that death is not the end of responsibility or compassion or love. In the autumn of 1890, in West Texas, a door opened that had been closed for 9 years. 19 children walked free. A doctor found the peace that had eluded him in death, and a grieving man discovered that even in the darkest places, even in the sealed tombs of our own making, there is always the possibility of redemption, always the chance that one act of kindness, one moment of courage, one choice to help another instead of turning away, can change everything. That is the lesson of the Caldwell house. That is the story of the door that no one could open, except the man who was already dead. And that is why the story is still told, still whispered in the dark places where the wind blows cold and the stars shine hard and bright, still remembered by those who understand that some stories are true in ways that transcend facts, that speak to something deeper and more lasting than the mere recording of events. The frontier is closed now, they say. The wild lands have been tamed, the unknown places mapped and settled and paved over with highways and parking lots. But the other frontier, the one between this world and the next, between what we know and what we fear, between life and death and all the gray spaces in between, that frontier remains as wild and unexplored as it ever was. And those who dare to cross it, who stand with one foot in the light and one in the darkness, who open doors that were meant to stay closed, they are the true frontiersmen and frontierswomen of our age, the explorers of the final territory, the ones who remind us that mystery and wonder and terror are not dead, just sleeping, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough or desperate enough to wake them.